Hello and welcome to a new episode of Other Record Labels. I'm your host, Scott Orr, where we talk about the art and culture of running a record label. Thank you so much for being a listener and following along with all the different types of episodes we've had. We've had some industry insider episodes. We also just launched a new monthly series called Case Studies. If you haven't heard that yet, go back one episode and check it out. And of course, our interview episodes are rolling along with some incredible labels coming up over the next couple of episodes, including today's episode with Carpark Records, one of the founders, Todd Hyman. It's such an exciting label to have on the show. I'm really excited for you to hear this interview. Be sure to, whatever stage you're in, and I hear from so many different people via email, which I love. Thank you so much for reaching out to me or the DMs on Instagram, and hearing these incredible stories of artists who are starting their own label to support their career or the careers of their peers. Or I hear people who have been running a label for a decade or more and who have found the show to be helpful and who have downloaded some of our resources. Please go to otherrecordlabels.com. Right there on the main page, we have all of our resources, including our record label toolkit and our free guide and our checklist and a bunch of templates. And there's some more exciting things coming up in the next couple of weeks. I'm excited for you to get your hands on that. Enjoy today's episode. I want to start out, I want to ask you, I often find that people who start record labels, obviously they're music fans, but they often have some sort of skill or passion that most musicians or music fans don't have. Like there's something I don't know if it's like a business mind or maybe even if it's just something like they work at a pressing plant and have access to something. I'm kind of curious, are you able to identify what it was for you that gave you the desire or the confidence to start a record label?
Well, I guess, I, as a teenager and young adult, I was kind of really into music that wasn't as popular, I guess, for lack of a better word.
Okay.
It was kind of like people didn't really call it indie music then, and
Sure.
Alternative music seemed like a weird catch-all phrase that didn't make any sense. Yeah. But, I don't know, when I was growing up in the mid to late 80s, I was into REM and the Smiths and New Order and that kind of stuff, and Fugazi. And anyway, so then I went to college in the early to mid 90s and worked at college radio. I was in the Chicago area and I went to Northwestern, and we had a really big college radio station. I think it was 7,000 watts or something. It could reach. Wow. It covered the entire north side of Chicago, from downtown all the way up to almost to the Wisconsin border. So it had a really big reach, and it was, I think, very influential. And I was really heavily involved with that. And I was the rock music director for 2 years there. And wow. I think that was instrumental in kind of bringing me to where I am today in terms of, getting my foot in the door in terms of I talked to radio promoters who were trying to promote their records with college radio, and then just kind of the taste making aspect of it, where I was my responsibility to add records to the radio station and determine what kind of music was appropriate for our station and what music I liked and thought was appropriate for the station. So I think that kind of those years doing that gave me the skills, I guess, or the practice to kind of figure out what kind of music was more popular than others and what qualities about certain songs, resonated with people more than others. And
so you've always had that kind of passion to find underappreciated music and make sure people appreciate it?
Yeah, something like that. And what was the other thing I was? Oh, and so I was kind of interested in. The idea had entered my mind after college, to start a record label, but I had kind of kept talking myself out of it because I was like, well, like I'm such like a rabid consumer of music, and I would always like on to like different things, and I would never really kind of like stick with one kind of music for any particular type of time.
Yeah.
Any particular length of time. So I was like, well, I'm going to start this label, and then I'm going to put out this kind of music, and then like a couple years later, I'm going to be tired of it. So why should I start a record label? So
what was your answer to that?
I just kind of like was trying to figure something else out. I was like, oh, maybe I'll get a job in the music industry doing like, I don't know, radio promotion or something like that. Or I worked in some record stores for a while. And then I went to a graduate program about popular music for a while. And I was like, well, maybe I'll be a writer, a scholar or something. But, then I moved back again to New York in the late 90s. And, I was working at this a friend's record store, and we had this like DJ night, and we were bringing in these live acts that were just kind of starting out, and I was like, well, I'm not sure what I want to do with my life still, but this seems like a good opportunity to start a record label if there ever was one. So, I kind of like asked a few of the people that I had met through this DJ night, and, started a record label and put out their music, and that's kind of how things got started.
And this was, okay, so you guys are at 21 years now, is that right? Or 22?
Yeah, I guess, well, I mean, technically it's almost 22 now, but yeah, we're 20 in our 21st year, I think.
So I think I read online, it was 1999 when you were doing this.
Yeah, I think the first release was November of 99.
Okay, so kind of paint the picture for us, because I remember 99, early 2000s, and there was, for an independent artist, and I'm not sure for an independent label, but I found that there was so much gatekeeping back then. Most retail happened in malls and in chains. There was no streaming or digital, so even making CDs was super expensive. What was it like? How did you overcome any gatekeepers or even financial obstacles back then?
Oh yeah, it was definitely an interesting time. I think Napster had just like gotten going,
right?
And so like there's kind of like this like Wild West free for all mentality with like people who had fast internet connections. Just like people were just like downloading music for free, and so we kind of entered like as like things were about to collapse seemingly,
right.
But I had spent a couple years before that. I'd worked in like some record stores in Manhattan, and I was the music buyer at one of them, and I was like placing orders and stuff, and just from working in college radio, and I was familiar with a lot of the distributors, those gatekeepers. So when I started the label, I knew where to send my music to get distributed. And it was a little nerve-wracking at first because I didn't know if anyone was going to place an order, and I didn't know any of them, but I just knew the companies. So I would I sent the stuff, and then there were still faxes going around at that time, and I remember I was just kind of waiting, and the orders were faxed in on my computer, and kind of just did it all out of my apartment.
Wow.
But it was very DIY back then. I just sent the records to distributors, and then I had another friend who had a label who had like a press list, and he was nice enough to share it with me. And
nice.
I had from my years of college radio, I knew all the decent radio stations, and so I just made up a list of like 100 stations that I would send promos to. And
did you have any, sorry to interrupt, did you have any label support or mentorship at the time? I mean, today you could go on Reddit and you could go on Facebook groups and talk to other indie labels. Did you have anything like that at the time?
I mean, if there was, I wasn't participating in them. I mean, I was in Manhattan, and I knew there were lots of music industry people around that I knew, and there were people I could ask questions to, to if I had any. But I guess I just felt like I had enough background on my own that I could do most of it on my own. So that's what I did, I guess.
Sorry.
I'm sorry.
No, that is a really great start. I mean, with your background at college radio and in a retail store, I mean, that really covers a lot of some of the early questions, especially back then, that people would have had. It would have been about distribution. It would have been about radio, maybe manufacturing. So for you to have experienced that in some of your jobs, that probably gave you a pretty good head start.
Yeah, definitely. And, I just, always going out and, I kind of knew most of the people who worked at most of the major indie labels back then, or I knew at least one or two people back in those days. So, it's a fairly small group of people in the end of the day.
What were some of the challenges back then? What were things that weren't necessarily going as you had expected when you first started out?
I don't know if I could answer that specifically. I mean, obviously I wanted to sell as many copies of the music that I put out as possible. So that was obviously the biggest challenge. Or, I just kind of learning as I go and trying to figuring things out. And, distribution, I guess, was a real big issue back then, more so than now, because, you could just find a company and they'll upload music for you for a small cut or whatever. But, back then it's either you had distribution or you didn't. And it was much more of a gatekeeping situation where, you had to kind of persuade a company to distribute your music, So, it was just,
and what were they looking for? What kind of metrics were they looking for? Were they looking for touring, or how would they? Why would they trust a new label like you?
I never asked them that question. I mean, I there was a bit of a calculation in some way. I didn't want it to be too overthought, but when I started the label, it was just experimental, IDM kind of electronic label.
Oh, okay.
And the first release was the Jake Mandel Place Kick EP. And, I guess broadly speaking, most people probably hadn't heard of Jake Mandel, but in the sort of circles of IDM and whatnot back then, he already had a record out and was kind of a known commodity. So I thought, if I was putting out his EP, that he had a little bit of a name, so that it wouldn't be I was just putting out something that no one had putting out something that no one had heard about. So that would help me get, I guess, some orders. And then I kind of linked it up with this other record by Mara Mare, which was our second release. And that was really, I mean, except for something he put out himself, that was really his first release. So I guess I was just figuring if I did that. And then I did a Kid 606 EP. That was the sixth thing we released. And so I was kind of thinking, he's kind of a known commodity. So I was kind of trying to balance things out between things that had names and things that were just starting out. And it just kind of, it was really just, I just sent the stuff to Forced Exposure and Carrot Top and Revolver, and just waited and hoped that they would order it, basically, is what happened, I think.
We're kind of hopping all over the place, but that's okay. You talked a little bit about, genres when we were beginning, and looking at your roster now, things seem pretty diverse and pretty eclectic. Although a lot of labels who start out today, they say we're going to represent this genre. What are your thoughts on that? Have you ever thought there's a type of music or even just a type of artist that we want to represent? And what do you think of that? And if you were starting a label today, would you do something exclusively under one genre?
Probably not. I mean, when we first started, we were pretty much like a one genre kind of label. It was like when I started, I was like, this is going to be like a kind of like a weird electronic digital kind of label. And, the first, for the first few years, it was all, like computer based, digital software kind of sounding all electronic music. And then, because that's when I started the label, that was my belief. I thought, labels needed to have like something to like attach themselves to.
Oh, I see. Okay.
Like a story or something. Like they needed a sound or whatever. But then like after a few years, I guess I was personally getting a little tired of that sound and was losing interest in that kind of music, and didn't think it was, when I first started, I thought it was going to really be like the future of like what was going on, like kind of like a new indie rock kind of thing.
Right.
And it never really kind of took off in that way. And so I was like, well, I don't want to stop the label, but I don't want to keep putting out this kind of music. So I'm just going to maybe gently go into this other area where it's kind of electronic, but there's like some other acoustic-y elements involved. And that way, my thinking at the time was like, oh, that way I won't like alienate too many people or whatever.
Yeah,
but
that's right.
I don't know. But so then I did that for a few years, and then that didn't really seem to be going anywhere either. And then me and my wife, we moved down to the DC area from New York in 2005, and I started hanging out a lot in Baltimore, and there was a lot of stuff going on there. Like the Wham City crew was going, and I met Beach House and Dan Deacon, and there was just like this whole group of people doing really interesting things musically, visual art, any kind of creative process you could imagine. And so that was kind of at that point where I was like, you know what, like, I don't think people really care that much if, Carpark is an electronic label or not. And I guess I don't really care much anymore. And I don't know why, I don't know why I kept this thing going the way I did for so long. But, by the time I moved down to Maryland and DC, I was just like, I'm just going to put out whatever I want.
Yeah.
And not worry about it. So that was what happened.
It's funny that you had that foresight even back before you started the label, that you may get sick of the genre that you're committing to. And I think that's really funny because today a lot of entrepreneurs don't have that foresight to think what I'm super excited and all consumed with right now may not be how I feel in 1 month or 5 years or 10 years from now. I think that's really wise to have that foresight. Because I know if I were to start a label again now, I would probably pick some sort of micro genre that I was obsessed with, but no doubt that would change in a couple of years.
Yeah. But then I did it anyway, and then I got tired of it anyway.
Exactly. So you knew yourself well. Now, I read you guys were doing vinyl back in the early 2000s. Is that right?
Yeah. I mean, from the very get-go, we were doing vinyl. I mean, the very first release was a CD-only release, but the second release, which came out in 1999, was vinyl and CD, and most, all of our major releases always had vinyl and CD. And I was coming, starting from this like IDM, electronic, whatever background.
Yeah. And
I was really into DJing in New York at the time. I was DJing at least probably once or twice a week. And, I also was really into like how, deep house and minimal techno and all kinds of other stuff. And so I just, coming from that background, at the time I was, vinyl seemed very important.
Right.
And, I was a rabid vinyl collector too. I had thousands of records, and so it was always just kind of like part of what I was doing, and it never even really occurred to me just to not do vinyl for our big titles,
And so it just came from the culture around the genre at the time?
Yeah, I mean, all through the 90s, whether it was like indie rock or dance music, like I've always been buying vinyl. Like I don't buy much vinyl these days anymore, but back then it was definitely definitely seemed like you know, a good way to kind of, I don't know if like proving your authenticity is the way to go, but you know, it just definitely seemed like you know, to be taken seriously, at least in my opinion, you needed to have vinyl for a record.
And what was it? What was the reception like from record stores or distributors with vinyl? I mean, would they have had a dedicated section for like 12 inches for house music and that kind of stuff, or you know, because I would have imagined that most of them would have been just racks of CDs.
No, well, I mean, I guess it depends on who you're talking to, but you know, like living in New York City when I did, like most of the stores that I would go to had, you know, one side was CDs and the other side was vinyl. So it was always there.
Oh, that's great.
And you know, the house music and the dance music distributors were different. Like I didn't really work much with those, but even, you know, like the Forced Exposures and Revolvers and those kind of companies, they sold a lot of vinyl back then as well.
And what was do you remember what the turnaround times were if you were pressing vinyl back then?
I think, you know, it's just funny to think about now, but yeah, I think we probably worked like 2 or 3 months lead time then.
Right.
And yeah, now we're doing like 6.
Yeah. That's crazy. So you brought up the Napster, and I'm curious, just sort of my own, you know, obsession. But when you're living through this time, starting a record label in '99, and then, you know, as the iPod comes out and iTunes came out, what was your perception of that back then, when that came onto the scene, and you had to make that decision? Do we, you know, upload our music to these, you know, paid digital platforms? What did you think about that at the time?
Do we upload our music to, are you talking about like
well,
iTunes
I guess
now?
iTunes would be, I mean, probably the first primary legitimate.
Yeah, I mean, I was all for it. So there was definitely, you know, there was like a few years there in between where it was just kind of like out of control and kind of like you put these records out and then you just saw people like just swapping them around online and whatnot. And, or one of our artists, Mari, he always tried to take advantage of it. He was always on Napster, and he would type in like, you know, Mari versus Brian Eno, or Mari versus Stereolab. So like people who were searching for those artists would find his songs, you know, and he would use it for self-promotion. That's basically.
Great. Yeah.
But, yeah, I mean, it was definitely like those early 2000s was like everything, you know, like things change quickly now, but you know, definitely it feels like the changes then were kind of like more impactful and longer lasting, you know, going from like Napster to like trying to get people to pay for stuff. And then, you know, there was like all that whole like period where records were like leaking and it was becoming, they were like news items, and it was just like really insane. And like then, you know, we had kind of like the switch over, like we would do some things on CDs and LPs, and then like smaller things at the beginning of we would do things on CD, but then it kind of switched over to where and we were doing just vinyl releases. So just a lot of stuff changing.
You know, as things still change today, is it hard for a record label who's been around for a while to adapt to a changing industry, or is it easier when you have a solid foundation?
Well, I think it's not too bad. I mean, you know, like we've been around for a while, and you know, if the changes come, we, you know, just do our research and decide if some of those changes should be part of our operations. I don't know if it's easier or more difficult, but I mean, we're pretty small staff, so you know, we're pretty adaptable and we can change pretty quickly. I would say more so than like a bigger label. Yeah.
Let me ask you, I've talked to a few labels about their growth or evolution over time, and I've heard this a few times. Maybe this doesn't apply to you, but I want to ask it anyway. Is that sometimes there's this moment that a label can identify where the label finds its groove, or it just something really clicks. And you know, I've been doing things on my own for 10 years, and I sometimes still feel like I'm waiting for something just to click. But and some labels, they find it in their first year. Do you remember a moment in the past 20 years where with the label, you know, you just realized this is working, this clicked, you know, maybe there was something that the fans responded to really well? Is there something that you can put your finger on?
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely been a few different eras of like kind of, I don't know, explosive or incredible growth maybe would be a good way to put it. But like the first one was probably back in like 2006 or 7, where we just had this insane period of like a year where we put out like the first Beach House record, Dan Deacon's Spider-Man of the Rings, and like Panda Bear Person Pitch. And it's just like, wow, it's just like so insane. Like, you know, like huge records for us. And it was like just me at that time. Like I was the only one. I mean, we had like publicists and radio promoters that I hired, but like there was no staff or anything. It was like me behind the computer, like all day, fancy, you know, like emails like coming in like every 2 or 3 seconds basically. And like I couldn't even like go out for like an hour or two. Wow. There was just like so much going on. And so that was like a really crazy time. And then I think maybe another crazy time would be kind of like around 2010 or 11, you know, when we started working with Toro and Moi and Cloud Nothings. Then we did, you know, another Panda Bear record. So just, that was kind of like the chill wave, whatever.
Sure.
Era.
Yeah. True. Yeah. Interesting. What makes a record sell well? I mean, over 21 years, have you found any common denominator that successful records share? Maybe not selling well is the wrong term. I mean, that's a byproduct of a great record. But is there any common denominators that you've seen?
Well, yeah, just have to have a great song that you've written. Is basically what it comes down to at the end of the day. It doesn't, you know, whether it's rock or pop or country or whatever, like it's got to be a good song. So, kind of how I look at it.
Sure, that's fair. When like leading into that with A&R and finding new artists, I mean, is that what guides you? It's the songwriting process, or do you have some sort of criteria?
I guess it's maybe like an unwritten criteria. I mean, I try and work in terms of finding artists kind of like at a real visceral level. Just like, you know, if I put it on and it resonates with me, like really quickly, like that's something, you know, like, I don't know, like I have to have like kind of like an immediate positive reaction. And, you know, that thankfully or unthankfully, but I guess thankfully it doesn't happen too often. So I know that when I hear something that I like, you know, like I know that I really like it because it doesn't happen very often.
Yeah. Oh, that's a good point. Yeah.
So yeah, like, you know, I guess it happens maybe 1, 2, or 3 times a year, I would maybe say. So, you know, it's hard to articulate, but, you know, I tend to gravitate towards, you know, catchy songs that, you know, have kind of like hummable choruses and stuff. And, you know, there's like a whole kind of like subgenre of indie music that, you know, it doesn't, I never quite understood it, but there's this whole like genre of music where people write songs and they're like incredibly popular, but like there's nothing catchy about it or nothing to latch onto it for me, but like people still like it. So that's, you know, like, this kind of like meandering indie rock thing. So that's not my thing, I guess.
Yeah, no, that's a really interesting point, how you can trust your gut, you know, trust your subconscious to make these decisions for you, which is not, you know, which is based upon, you know, an entire lifetime of listening to music. So I think that's a really wise thing. And I would say the same thing happens to me where, if I'm hearing 2 or 3 records a day just out in the world, it's so few in a year that actually just, cause me to stop everything and I need to hear it 100 times. So it's so wise to say like that you can really trust that that signal.
Yeah, and it's just like, it takes me back to like when I was college music director, and like it was like early to mid 90s. There was like post Nirvana gold rush, and like we were getting sent like hundreds of records literally a week.
Wow.
And like I would have to like sit there for hours like on the weekends to like try and figure out what we should add, and I'd have to like put a 7-inch on the record, and like I would basically have to like kind of figure out within like 10 seconds whether it was like decent or not, because I didn't have time to listen to like 100 records,
Yeah.
So,
but that's totally fair, and I can do that too. I feel like listening to 5 to 10 seconds of a song can give you a pretty good idea, and chances are you're going to be right whether you like it or not.
Yeah. So, and then, then we had a bunch of other external cues, like if it's like a good record label, does the album cover look any good? Like,
yeah. Oh, sure.
Do they have other records out? So that kind of stuff too. But
I want to ask you about,
and the same works today, but in different ways.
Yeah. I want to ask you about other revenue streams. Our audience, our listeners are, record label owners and people thinking about starting a record label for the most part, also independent artists. But, a lot of us, a lot of labels I've talked to have found success in, obviously you have a foundation of selling physical records, and if you can have some success with streaming, that's great. But it's also the alternative revenue streams or the additional revenue streams. Do you have any advice on where smaller labels should be looking to bring in more income for their label?
Well, traditionally we would make a good amount of money with licensing. It's a very important part of our business.
Sure.
Unfortunately, it's been a bit slow the past year because there hasn't been as much production going on.
Right.
But it's definitely, after streaming, I would say is kind of like our second biggest source of income.
Mm-hmm.
So it's just important to have people doing that kind of work for you who are on the same page as you and understand the music that you're putting out and have the same goals as you. So whether that's, someone that you're paying on salary, or whether you work with a company that takes a cut,
right,
a third-party company, because it's like anything, in the music industry. If you're not seeing eye to eye with anyone, it's not going to really work out.
Yeah.
So whether it's a manager or a sync license person or a radio promoter, they have to understand each other. So we're
Sure.
lucky that we work with people that I think understand us, and so it works out pretty well for us.
On that note, I think I saw you guys have released instrumental versions of some of your releases. I've done that too. I think it's great, and I love it as a fan. And it must be a great way to amortize production costs. I mean, is that something you guys might do more of, or what was some of the thought process involved with that?
I think I know Chaz from Toro put out some instrumentals on tape on his own.
Yeah.
But I don't think we didn't really have much to do with that. He just kind of.
Oh, okay.
But
I think it's a great idea.
But we're definitely looking into like new ways to kind of make additional products available. Like with the past year, we've sold like so much more direct sales, like through our website and our Bandcamp site. Yeah. So we've just been trying to come up with ideas just to make more kind of like exclusive products, just to people bring things to people that they want, so they haven't been able to get, and also get gives us more money because not as much money is coming in.
Sure.
So
I've heard that the pandemic has driven a lot of online sales for some labels, which I think is fantastic. I mean, I've heard that from quite a few labels that things may have been pretty quiet in the first month or so, but then as the lockdown kind of hung on for a couple of months, that people started buying records. I think that's fantastic. That's such a great byproduct of all this.
Yeah, I mean, like I was looking at our PayPal monthly sales, and like from like January, February last year to like March and April, it went up like fourfold. So
that's amazing.
It's just insane, and yeah, we're just trying to. I'm doing all the mail order myself now, which is something I haven't done in a few years.
Oh, okay.
Because we don't have anyone in the office, so
okay, wow.
It's been my weekends doing a lot of mail order.
Oh man, I feel like I'm like 100 years behind the times, but I just figured out our Canadian online shipping platform. I mean, for so long I've been taking stuff to the post office and creating this huge line behind me and pissing off everyone. And it was just such a terrible process. But now I think it was our Canadian Post has figured out, like, has just a more intuitive system online, but it's like a dream come true.
Yeah, that reminds me of when I first started Carpark and when I was living in New York City, and I don't think any of that existed, any online stuff existed. And I basically, when I had lots of mail, I would literally put it in like the biggest suitcase I had with wheels, and I would cart it over like a 10-minute walk to the post office. And the New York post offices are just the worst. They're all like really small, and there's like tons of people who are using them. So I would like. And anytime I had to go to the post office, it was like at least an hour of my life. Was like gone, But so now it's great. I have, a laser writer printer here that prints out labels, and I've got the software.
Oh, great.
And I just like print everything out, and then I just, go to the USPS website and create a pickup for the next day, and I just dump it all out on the front porch, and someone comes and picks it up.
Oh, what a dream.
Post office.
That's great.
Yeah.
I mean, the dream will be when fans can 3D print their own records at home, but soon, but for now, that's as good as it can get. Talk to me about the subsidiary labels, how that works and how those came to be.
Well, they first started out of my desire, as I was talking about earlier, about how I was getting tired of just putting out like digital IDM music. So I was like, well, at that point, with my thinking at that point, I was like, well, Carpark, I can't put out like all these other kinds of music on Carpark because this is an electronic label. So how do I do that? I have to start another label.
Yeah.
So, they just kind of like, I don't know if I was like intentionally trying to start a label, but like, there's a kind of certain situations arose where it just kind of like made sense, and I pursued it. So, I was friends with the Animal Collective guys living in New York City, and there was like when they first started, they didn't really call themselves Animal Collective, they didn't want to necessarily. They wanted to be this kind of like looser kind of groupings of players, and so if like Dave and Noah played, it was Aviator and Panda Bear, and if it was Dave and Noah and Brian, it was Panda Bear, Aviator and Panda Bear and Geologist, and that was how the shows were built. And I thought it was a little confusing for your average consumer, and so I was like, well, guys, why don't we start this label where you can like put all your stuff out and people know it's like Animal Collective without like you having to like call yourselves Animal Collective or whatever.
Yeah.
And they were into that idea, so that's kind of like how Alltrack started. And then Acute Records, I guess was maybe started before Alltracks, or it got off the ground sooner. I was at the time I lived around the corner from this bar called Plant. And I think it was Monday nights, they had this like post-punk night where this dude, Dan Selzy, used to DJ and spin like all kinds of crazy post-punk stuff. And so I would go there, and I think the writer, Simon Reynolds, was there, and I was kind of friendly with him. And he introduced me to Dan because he was like, "Oh, Dan's looking to reissue this Theoretical Girls record, and thought maybe the two of you would, want to talk about it or something." So we started talking, and that's kind of like how Acute started, because Dan had a bunch of stuff he wanted to reissue, and he didn't really have much experience like doing the business side of it. So I was like, well, I have experience getting the records out, and I also was really into post-punk stuff as well. So that was part of the appeal, because we both share the same interest and passion for that kind of music. So that's kind of how Acute started, and we kind of went like that for many years with like those Carpark, Acute, and Paw Tracks.
And you were still running everything. It was still just you, though, essentially, like the back end.
Yeah. I mean, I hired my first employee in the beginning of 2011, end of 2010, I think. Because my wife was about to have our first child, and I was like, well, there's no way I'm going to be able to do this the way I'm doing it with a baby, I'm going to be like exhausted. So, and then, those Paw Tracks kind of faded. I forget exactly, sometime like in the 2015-16 area, I think, if I had to guess. And then Acute kind of, Dan, that kind of stopped a few years ago as well. So, and then we started up a couple other sub-labels since then. We've started Company Records with Chaz from Toro and Wax 9 with Sadie from BD Ortiz.
Yeah, I like that idea. I mean, I've always thought about that too. I think, even just if it's just a doing business as a name, but everything in the background is the same, it's kind of cool to start fresh and to kind of give a micro label its own identity. I like that.
Yeah.
I was thinking when I was doing some research about Cloud Nothings, who I love. Tell me about I was going back at how long that they've been with the label. Tell me about the benefits of investing in artists over the long term. I mean, these guys just came out with a new album, and I think that their first album with you was in 2010. Is that right?
Around then.
There must be something rewarding about, being with an artist for that long. Yeah,
I mean, I wish none of our artists would ever leave us. I like keeping them around, and just developing the relationship and being friends with them and watching their artistic career grow and develop. It's just very rewarding just to be a part of that process. And, like for Dylan from Cloud Nothings, like to go from, 18 or 19 years old to 28 or 29 years old is like a lot happens in those years.
Sure.
Just to see him become who he is now has been very, very rewarding. And, I'm always very grateful when artists, stick around. We work really hard for artists, and it's always nice when you know that they see that and appreciate it and want to stick around.
Yeah. If you could, I don't want to put you on the spot, but if you could give young up-and-coming record labels one piece of advice, what would it be? I know that's a huge question. I know you've got 21 years of experience, but I'm just thinking from our listeners' perspective. Is there something, if you could tell them one thing, what advice would you give them?
Gosh, well, I mean, having a little bit of money always helps. And because, I think, well, I mean, I guess if you're first starting, maybe it's cool to like just put out a few records on your own just to see what happens and see what it's like. But I guess if you're wanting to start a label that's like an actual business that sustains itself and makes money, I guess you really need to do it right, in quotes. And so if you want to do it right, you need, someone who knows what they're doing on like the publicity and on the radio end and on like the distribution end and marketing. So it's just, if you know those things already, or whether you can hire someone to do that for you, I think would help. Though, then there's also the issue of like, if you're just starting out, you're probably putting out records by people that no one's heard about. So that makes it very difficult on a label that no one's heard about. So it's obviously a huge number of hurdles that you have to jump over to get to like this sort of like point of recognition and respectability. And so yeah, it's very hard. So it's hard to
Sure.
My advice is it's hard to do that. But
well,
I guess just following on my sorry.
No, I was just what you said kind of inspired me, like to get thinking about, a lot of us, especially because it's so easy. There's so few barriers these days to just release one record. It's easy to do that, but it is hard to make that switch from doing it right, like you said, quote unquote. Like it's almost best to do that from the very beginning, because for me, I had the hard time of when do I switch over from this being just silly and fun and not necessarily taking it serious to, I should probably start taking this serious.
Yeah. I mean, when like I said before, when I first started, I was kind of doing everything myself. And I think it worked for a certain amount of time to a certain extent. Like I was, fortunate that I was, living in New York City, and like I actually knew a lot of the writers who were writing about the kind of music that we would write about. So it wasn't like that much of a stretch. Like I could get like reviews in Spin or Rolling Stone because like I actually knew people who did those jobs, right. But then, I guess to get like kind of like the next level up, you is kind of where I would probably falter, like I wouldn't be able to like get cover stories very well or bigger features and that kind of stuff. And I think when we did Panda Bear Young Prayer on Podtrax, it was the second Podtrax release. It was like 2004, I think. That was the first time I hired a publicist.
Oh, okay.
So that was took
Sure.
5 years before I hired a publicist.
Yeah. Oh, that's interesting. I think that's probably a similar story with other labels. Todd, this has been fun. Thank you so much for doing this and sharing your experiences over the past 21 or so years. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, no problem, man. Anytime.
Thank you all for listening. Go to carparkrecords.com to support that label. I hope you enjoyed this episode with Todd. Please go to our website, otherrecordlabels.com. I don't know when the last time you were there. I don't know when the last time you were visiting. I update it at least a few times a week, adding some new features and some new things to help record labels. So please go to otherrecordlabels.com to see what's new. Thank you for being a listener.